This is the story of Garuda Indonesia Flight 865. On the 13th of June 1996, a Garuda Indonesia DC-10 was being fueled on the ground at Japan's Fukuoka airport. The plane was on its way to Garuda's main hub at Soekarno Hatta International Airport in Jakarta, with a stopover at Ngurah International Airport. The flight engineer walked around the plane to visually inspect the plane. By 11:35 a.m., the pilots were settled into the cockpit and the captain was briefing the flight engineer and the first officer about the flight, including emergency scenarios. By 11:54 a.m., the plane was fueled and ready. ATC gave the all-clear. The DC-10's number 2 engine roared to life and the engines under the wings were started as the plane was being pushed back from the gate. Fukuoka Tower asked the plane to taxi via the Echo 2 taxiway and to hold short of runway 16. They had to wait for a landing airplane to pass. After the plane had landed, the tower comes on and radios the crew. Taxi into position and hold short runway 16. At 12:06 p.m., the tower cleared Flight 865 to take off. The captain said, "Set auto throttles on," and they were off. The plane began to accelerate down the runway. The engine's N1 value stabilized at around 113%. The first officer calls out 100 as they push past 100 knots on their takeoff roll. The first officer calls out V1 as the plane reached 151 knots. They were now past the point of no return. Should an issue arise, they could not stop the plane on the remaining amount of runway. The first officer calls out rotate and the plane eases into the sky. The plane had barely left the ground when the flight engineer called out, "Engine failure, number 1." Before the flight engineer even called out the failure, the captain knew that something was wrong. However, the flight engineer was wrong. Engine number 1 had not failed. Engine number 3 had. The captain immediately tries to stabilize the plane. The loss of thrust on the right side was pushing the plane towards the right. The captain pushed the control column to bring the plane back down. On the CVR, you could hear the throttles hitting the idle stops. The captain had done all this in the time between realizing that something was wrong and the flight engineer making the call out. The plane had reached a height of 9 feet off the ground. As soon as the wheels made contact, the crew braked as hard as they could. The plane veered away from the runway center line, but it did not stop. Soon it was off the runway entirely. The plane continued to travel over the grass and it was headed straight for a road that was south of runway 34. But with the speed that the plane was carrying, there was no way that the plane would be able to stop in time. The plane crashed into the road. The landing gears and the lower portion of the engines under the wings were sheared off. Fukuoka Airport had a grass buffer zone around the airport for aircraft noise abatement. The plane continued on, now scraping along the grass buffer on its belly. Now, the engine number 1 from under the wing comes off. Finally, the plane comes to a stop after 620 meters or 2,000 feet from the threshold of runway 34. But the ordeal is not over. At 12:08 p.m., the controller lets the firefighting division know that a plane had just gone down. The DC-10 was fueled for a long flight to Indonesia, and the risk of a fire was very real. By 12:14 p.m., the firefighters had reached the crash site. As they approached the crash site, the firefighters saw flames peeking through the cracked fuselage of the crashed DC-10. A small fire was also seen near the belly of the airplane and near the wings. By 12:28 p.m., the acrid black smoke changed to white, signifying that the fire had been brought under control. The firefighters discharged foam onto the fuel that had already leaked to prevent a second fire from starting. By 4:31 p.m., the fire was completely under control and extinguished, but the plane was now a burnt-up husk. Despite the fire, the evacuation was swift. However, the accident claimed the lives of 3 people. 272 people survived the accident, although 170 people did sustain injuries. No one on the ground was injured. The captain and the co-pilot survived, and the captain was interviewed at length. From his account, they understood that the takeoff was normal at first. The engines were working perfectly, all instruments were in the green, and the aircraft responded to control inputs by the captain. That is, all was okay until rotation. To quote the captain, When the aircraft commenced rotation, I felt something unusual, because it would not become positively airborne. Even if it had become airborne, the altitude would have been relatively low." End quote. The captain was not confident that the plane would be able to climb out safely. To quote the captain again, "As I instinctively sensed that if the aircraft continued the takeoff, it would collide with neighboring buildings, I made a decision to abort the takeoff, pushed the control column, applied maximum braking, and deployed full reverse thrust." The captain continued, "I recall that I saw poles of the approach lights and a small building ahead. I steered the aircraft by rudder operation to the right side of the runway." End quote. Now we know why the captain did not continue with the takeoff. The captain was not confident in the plane's ability to climb out safely. The captain was concerned about the plane crashing into neighboring buildings if it could not climb out safely. Also, the plane veering off to the side was a conscious decision by the captain to avoid hitting any buildings at the end of the runway. The interview of the other pilots highlighted more of the same. The testimony of the first officer corroborated what the captain had said. The testimony of the flight engineer gives us a little bit more insight into what happened. As soon as the V1 call was made, the flight engineer observed the N1, N2, and EGT values on engine number 3 dropping. And so the flight engineer makes the engine failure call out. The flight engineer meant to call out an engine failure on engine number 3, but instead he called out an engine failure on engine number 1. The captain, then realizing what had happened, pushed the control columns forward and set the engines to idle and attempted to stop the plane. But what about the aborted takeoff itself? Was that called for? The Garuda manuals are very clear about the matter. The manual says that a high-speed rejected takeoff can be very hazardous. The manual does allow for a high-speed rejected takeoff under two conditions. Number one, you have to have a very positive loss of thrust, and number two, the aircraft condition clearly renders it unflyable. So basically, the manual assumes that you're not going to abort a takeoff at high speed. But at the time of the failure of the number 3 engine, the plane was 15 knots above the V1 speed. Other than the number 3 engine failing, nothing else was wrong with the plane. But the investigators are sure that the captain should have gone ahead with the takeoff. Looking back at their training records, they see that the pilots had a discussion on a rejected takeoff close to V1 speeds in cold weather. But we don't know if this ever happened, as the training records for the flight crew was not retained, and also this was not followed up with practical training. It was just all on paper. The investigators focused their attention on the number 3 engine, as it was the one that had failed. They found the engine pinned between the ground and the wing, all deformed. The engine was substantially damaged. Listening to the CBR, they heard a sound as the number 3 engine failed. Maybe the engine was damaged pre-crash. It sounded like the engine had a compressor stall, so they focused on the third engine. Tearing the engine down, they found the HPT Stage 1 blade cracked, and the rest of the engine was damaged from the failure of the Stage 1 blade. However, the outer casing of the engine had not been penetrated, meaning that the damage was contained to within the engine itself. Looking closely at the blades, they find intergranular oxidation fatigue cracking. Under certain conditions, the oxygen atom gets diffused into another metal due to certain chemical conditions, and due to oxygen in the chemical structure, it impacts the physical characteristics of the metal, sometimes making it weaker. But Garuda Indonesia had been doing inspections of the blades with a borescope for quite some time now. In fact, the engine had undergone a borescope inspection on the 26th of May, 1996, and it showed no cracks. But the issue with the IGO fatigue cracks is that they're hard to find. The blades themselves have a cooling air passage carved into them, and that's where the cracks formed. This means that the cracks are almost impossible to find with a borescope. It wasn't as if the manufacturer of the engines, General Electric, was unaware of the issue. GE had designed a new blade assembly that would not be so hard to maintain, and the operators of the engine were told to replace the old blade assembly with the new one when the old blade assembly reached 6,000 cycles. But at the time of the accident, the blades had been in service for 6,182 cycles. Had they followed the General Electric recommendation of discarding blades over 6,000 cycles, This would not have happened. But how could this happen? Garuda had contracted out the maintenance of the CF6 engines to KLM, and they were the ones that did the maintenance on the engine itself. At KLM, they did stick to the 6,000 cycle rule, but if the blades had not reached 6,000 cycles, it was put back into an engine. When KLM overhauled this engine back in November of 1994, the blade had 4,894 cycles on it, and since that figure was less than 6,000, the blades went back into an engine. And it stayed there as the cycle count slowly went up and up, eventually going over 6,000. At that point, the plane was flying on borrowed time. It was just a matter of time before the blade would fail, taking the engine with it. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. A big thank you to L Aviation for letting me use his amazing video on my video. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. Stay safe, wash your hands. I'll catch you guys next time.